It's a great honor to be here. I want to thank every one of you, and some of you will have to suffer me twice today because I can see that some of you were in the talk an hour ago, maybe. I have spent more than 50 years in clinical microbiology. My original professor received me in his office in 1971, and he took one look at me and he said, "I don't have time for you now, come back tomorrow." I came back tomorrow, and here I am. I was the product of, actually, you've seen I had a jacket when I came. I hate jackets. I am the product of a father who was an infectious disease clinician, who married my mother, who was a pharmacist. And if you cross an ID physician with a pharmacist, you get a clinical microbiologist. With a main interest in antimicrobials. Pure mental. Can't be helped. I spent some of my childhood, my father has told me, and my mother corroborated that. This was, of course, in 1949, and my father used me to test various penicillin intramuscular concoctions, for want of a better word. I often cried because they actually hurt. And my father always considered there is something wrong with me rather than with the concoction. I want to thank all of you because over the last 25 years I have traveled the world for EUCAST, mostly for EUCAST, also for ESTMID. I stepped off a plane in Beijing some years ago. I went to the Beijing University Medical School. I did what I was supposed to do, and they drove me back to the airport, and the Norwegian flight hostess said, "Oh, you're coming back with us as well." And that was sort of the kind of traveling I was doing. This was before COVID, it was before Zoom and Teams and the electronic meetings. And the thing, when I think back, is that you always welcomed me wherever I came, whether it was in Brazil or in China or in Australia or wherever. And there were many places. And you always fed me well. I remember all of those meals that you treated me to with national specialties and nice things to drink and eat. And the discussions we had about what is reasonable and what is not reasonable, and how can we be part of EUCAST. My first introduction to scientific endeavors in foreign places was actually in ICC in London, 1975. And when Ian showed that picture, I can remember both Ian Phillips and Alistair Geddes at that conference. I can remember Ernest Chain giving the introductory speech in the Royal Albert Hall. I can remember J.D. Williams, and I have a photograph back home where I stand talking to J.D. Williams and people, and I was so impressed with the fact that he wanted to talk to a measly young Swedish microbiologist until someone pointed out that in that picture there's also a young, beautiful girl. They were lovely times, and I can remember that, if my memory serves me, there were 15,000 people at the London meeting, and it was exceedingly warm that July, and you had to change your shirt twice a day. Well, I'm going to talk to you about the quirks of the EUCAST system. And that will be a different talk than the one I gave an hour or two ago. I will concentrate on the quirks, but I will leave them for the latter part of the presentation. I won't go through all of this, but this is sort of my list of endeavors over the years. And I would just like to draw your attention to the fact that my first paper was tetracycline resistance. And I'm sure my last paper will be tetracycline resistance. So the circle is sort of full very soon. My first talk was at the ICC, and it was on the prolonged excretion in urine of gentamicin following one single injection. And we later understood that it was captured by the cortex in the kidney and then released over the next 4 or 5 or 6 months, producing not very high, but concentrations in urine. As you can see at the bottom there, I'm married to Annika, and Annika sits in the audience today. I have 3 grown children, or we have 3 grown children together. One who deals with expensive shipping accidents, one who deals with research in criminology, and one who is an oncologist. I'm really proud of the fact that they're all doing different things. I have 5 grandchildren, and I really love my 2 large dogs. A disclosure, I was once the president of ESCMID. I was then followed by Murat, Mario, Jesus, Annelies, and Robert. And Robert is here today. But you can see that I was probably one of the last elephants because the photoshopping activity of male, overweight, nicely dressed presidents was discontinued. I haven't seen a photograph where they have added more men to the list. So, here are some of the quirks that we will be discussing. Why not base all breakpoints on PK/PD? I hear that a lot. Why do we insist on identifying the MIC wild-type distribution? How is there a difference between breakpoints and ECOFFs? Is there a difference? Should there be a difference? Are all EUCAST clinical breakpoints based on ECOFFs? That's a common misunderstanding. Why are breakpoints not allowed to bisect target species MIC wild-type distributions? Why was there a need for new susceptibility categories and definitions? It's so irritating. What about arbitrary breakpoints? How will we report or ever offer an S? Placing breakpoints in brackets. What's the rationale and usefulness of that? And inventing the whole concept of the area of technical uncertainty. What should we do with screening breakpoints in tables? How should we use the dosing tab? It does not always agree with other guidance, dosing, and recommendations. What about dosing and administration in pediatric infections? What should we do when there are no breakpoints? The last point we've already discussed today, so I won't revisit that. But let us start by looking at some of the assets instead. It was created in 1996-97. It was created along a blueprint of NCCLS because Ian Phillips felt that we needed a competitor to NCCLS in Europe. At that time, there were 6 national, very strong committees in Europe. Some of them had 20, 30 years on their backs before EUCAST, or for that matter, NCCLS in Europe came along. We forgot to tell them that they were about to be out-competed. So they never discovered that they were about to be out-competed, and they just ignored what was going on in EUCAST. The only breakpoint that was given in those days was linezolid, and the newly formed EMA, European Medicines Agency, would have nothing to do with EUCAST. ESCMID was disgruntled, Andreas was in those days part of the ESCMID executive, and he was certainly disgruntled with the kind of money EUCAST was spending and the lack of results he was seeing. In Istanbul, again, the circle comes full. I was asked to take over after Ian Phillips, but my first task was to find out whether EUCAST could actually be abandoned without too many repercussions. I came back, and my advice was that we should continue to invest in EUCAST, but that we should revise and rejuvenate EUCAST in a different way. The advice I got was, all right then, but for God's sake, lose that abominable acronym EUCAST. It's tainted with failure, and it will never fly. Find another one. But the long and the short of it is that that acronym is actually good. It's the European Committee on Antimicrobial Susceptibility Testing. So it stayed and stuck. So in 2002, together with Scientific Secretary Derek Brown from Cambridge, UK, we set out to rejuvenate EUCAST. I traveled Europe, and then I traveled South America, and then I traveled China and Australia and South Africa, and etc., etc. And everywhere I tried to convince people to leave CLSI and to go to EUCAST. Sometimes I succeeded, sometimes I failed. The committee was organized and financed by ESCMID and later co-financed by EU and even later by ECDC. It was acknowledged by EMA because I went to West Ferry Circus in London on a day when they decided to have a fire drill, and everyone had to evacuate the building very quickly, and we became great friends in the process. So I can recommend fire drills. They are bonding. And when I left London from EMA, I had a promise from EMA that they would not set breakpoints, they would validate, evaluate EUCAST breakpoint. And since that day, they haven't set a single breakpoint of their own. They have accepted what EUCAST has proposed. It was supported by national committees. It was in participation with colleagues all over the world. It fielded a website which now has 80,000 visits per month and 200,000 unique page views every month. And it also has a dedicated web page, an archive for MIC distributions from all over the world. This is the original committee. Can you spot the Greek? Can you spot the German? Can you spot the Englishman? I think you can, and it's amazing that in this picture, every single person fulfills whatever ideas you had about what a Greek, what a German, what an Englishman should look like. There were jollier pictures than the previous one, and I think you can see that we had a lot of fun at the same time as we did a lot of hard work. And I would especially like to mention Martin Steinbach, who is over here. Can you see the arrow? Yeah. And Johan Mouton, who's here, both of them now unfortunately deceased. I would also like to acknowledge the chairs over these years and the scientific secretaries. To the left, Ian Phillips, who started the whole thing, then me, and then Raphael, who sits down there. Wave your hand, Raphael. Christian Giske, who's not here, and Søren Garterman, who is the current chair. The scientific secretaries down below, Derek Brown and myself, rinsing chanterelles, John Turnage, good friend in Adelaide, and now Mandy Wootton from Cardiff in Wales. There is a general committee, there is a steering committee of 12 experts, and there are public consultations prior to all major decisions. There are a number of steering committee meetings, of course, most of them nowadays by Zoom. There are postgraduate courses, participation in many ESCMID activities, and so on and so forth. All European and many non-European countries are represented. We are grateful for our MOUs with EMA and now also with the MHRA, the UK organization that took over when the UK left the EU. And as I said, all EUCAST proposed breakpoints since daptomycin early 2000 have been accepted by EMA. One of the milestones of EUCAST was when ECDC in 2019 decided that to accept only EUCAST generated data for their surveillance programs. And of course that was a helpful push in our efforts to convince people to go EUCAST. Today Europe is basically green, everyone is on EUCAST. We still have discussions with some countries. At the bottom you can see countries outside, or rather you can see examples of countries outside Europe who are now on EUCAST. We have lost control, to be quite honest, as to who are on EUCAST recommendations and guidelines. One of the attractions has been that it's readily available via the website. There is no fee. It's a free participation, and you can be part of the public consultation process, irrespective of who you are. You will have to accept being there with your name, but otherwise there is no special requirements. So, for example, we recently concluded the consultation on proposed breakpoints for infective endocarditis. And the upcoming consultations will be on nocardia breakpoints, how to dose children, and more. These are the two websites. To the left, the general website at www.eucast.org, and to the right, the MIC website with distributions and ECOFFs. One of our assets have been that we have two EUCAST development laboratories, and we've managed to finance and uphold these through the help of ESCMID, among others, over now many years, actually since the early 2008. One is the EDL in Sweden, and the other one is for fungi in Denmark. Expert advice and troubleshooting, rapid response, help desk, often within 24 hours if you have a question. We develop and evaluate methods. We develop disk diffusion correlates to MIC breakpoints. And we evaluate quality material, the quality of commercial material. So when you complain about a material that you think doesn't work the way it should, we will look into it. If you're right, we will issue a warning on the EUCAST webpage. We deal, of course, with education, courses, site visits, observerships, and we take visitors to the laboratory. Above is the EDL in Växjö, Sweden, for bacteria, and at the bottom there is the EDL for fungi in Copenhagen, Denmark, with Maiken Kavling Arendrup as the head. We publish our findings in peer-reviewed journals, and that list is part of what is published from the antifungal subcommittee. I also want to acknowledge the growing collaboration between EUCAST and CLSI. Someone said today, when will we have a universal global system for antimicrobial susceptibility testing and breakpoints the same for everyone? I don't know whether that will ever happen, but I can say that the collaboration between CLSI and EUCAST is an ever-growing entity. And there are a number of technical concerns where there is no good reason at all to have differences. And we're trying to tease them out and to find ways of solving those. Many countries have formed national AST committees, not to set breakpoints, but to respond to consultations, but also to be responsible for the introduction of AST, whatever system, AST in their respective countries. And today we heard a wonderful presentation about the difficulties and the successes of implementing EUCAST breakpoints in Turkey. One of the things we've used the NACs for has been to test things that we've developed. So we develop something and we say, whoa, what a good idea, how clever of us. And then we want to make sure that what can work in Sweden or in Växjö or in Copenhagen for the fungi can also work out there in all the other laboratories. So just as an example, the rapid AST directly from blood culture bottles was tested in 56 labs all over Europe, including Turkey, Italy, Greece, France, Spain, you name it. All of them were in there. And they had one description, what to do, how to do it, how to interpret. And it worked perfectly well in all those 56 laboratories except one. I won't tell you which one. And I also want to remind you that interpreting susceptibility test results is more than just breakpoints. It's the whole system of expert rules and expected phenotypes. And for both of those, there is ample help, tables, links, and what have you not, on the EUCAST webpage. And they will help you interpret those values that you get. So summarizing the assets before we go into the quirks. The representativity, Europe and many parts of the world, formal recognition by ECDC, EMA and MHRA, the fact that EMA accepts EUCAST proposed breakpoints rather than suggesting their own, the decisions by committee consensus, the public consultation process where everyone gets to say their opinion, and you can read all those opinions because they are published on the EUCAST webpage. All guidance freely available, guidance on rapid AST directly from blood cultures, and we now have ample evidence from many laboratories that it is not difficult to make RAST work. The Rapid Response Help Desk is often mentioned by colleagues out there in the world who put questions to us, and they say, wow, we didn't expect to get an answer within an hour. Sometimes it's 24 hours, but something like that. The website for everyday business and the MIC distributions, the EDLs, the financial support through EU and ESCMID is, of course, absolutely valuable and necessary. The network of national AST committees and functions. Now, let's get to the quirks, the irritations. That was the list we discussed at the very beginning. It hasn't changed over the last 20 minutes. Can I remind you that at the beginning of things, everything was very simple? This is the NCCLS first supplement from 1981. And I know it's a bit small in the font, but that's what the Americans used in those days, so there we are. It's noteworthy that it leads by the disk content, well, the agent in the first column, then the disk content, then the zone diameter that would correlate to resistant, and zone diameters for intermediate and zone diameters for susceptible. And you can see that the MIC was sort of added at the very end as an afterthought So the breakpoint was actually the zone diameter breakpoint, and then the committee told you what was the approximate MIC value that would correspond to that zone diameter breakpoint. Since then, both CLSI and EUCAST, of course, has turned that around, and all breakpoints are MIC breakpoints, and then we look for the disk diffusion correlate. We all use the same tools for setting breakpoints, so why don't we arrive at the same result? We put different emphasis on the different tools. So here are the tools we need, and I'm absolutely sure that my friends in the CLSI would say, yes, we use the same tools. We may not have them in that order, or we may not put the same emphasis on the individual tools, but we will want target infections. We would like to know what infections are we going to set breakpoints for, and what species are relevant, and what exceptions might there be. And I've sat through many CLSI meetings where people show the MIC distributions of those target species. We want the pharmacokinetics and we want the pharmacodynamics, and over periods of time we have put lots of emphasis on pharmacodynamics. In EUCAST, maybe not quite so much at this point in time. It's still very important. It speaks to the dose and dosing schedules and modes of administration and what can you do with all those things. But we've come to realize that biology is maybe not entirely mathematics, and that PK/PD needs to be more species-specific than we considered over a 10-year period or so. We want the doses, of course, and the modes of administration, and then we would love to have clinical outcome data for target infections, target species, wild-type and non-wild-type organisms, specific resistance mechanisms. And do you think we have all that? Very rarely do we have all that. Mostly, we have clinical outcome data for wild-type organisms. Can I remind you that the MIC is not an absolute value? It's easy to believe that the MIC is an absolute value, because how can something with 4 decimals not be an absolute value? What happens is that you start at a certain concentration, say 256, and then you halve that concentrations forever and ever. And you're bound to eventually get values which are 0.125 and 0.064 and 0.32, etc. It doesn't make it exact. It's just the nature of how mathematics are. MICs will be affected by almost every change in circumstances in the test. It could be time, it can be the size of the inoculum, the temperature, the pH, the ions. Why do you think we inoculate these plates, or whether they're disk diffusion plates or broth microdilution plates with a specific inoculum? Well, we don't want it to get cloudy already when we inoculate the well, because if it's cloudy already from the beginning, we're absolutely stumped. And we don't want to put so little in the well that we have to wait for a week before we can read the plate. So the inoculum is the result of a practical consideration. We would like to be able to read the plates after we've slept. So we set it up, we go home, we come back in the morning, 16 to 20 hours later, and we read the plates, and we have an inoculum that fits with that. It has no other secret meaning than that. It's not an exact measurement, even when you are really good at it. And I mean really good at it. And most of us would fail doing that. But when you're really good at it, you can reproduce a certain MIC to ±1 dilution. And if you look at the bottom left, This is the result of 767 repeat tests by 2 technicians who are really good at it. And you can see that it's not one value, despite the fact that it's one of the same strain over and over again. It's actually 3 different values. And the distribution is over ±1 dilution step. If you look to the right, that's actually 30,000 plus clinical strains tested 30,287 times, each contributing 1 MIC value from all over the world. There are contributions from major laboratories all over the world. And if you look at the distribution of the 1 strain tested 700 plus times and the 30,000 clinical strains, there's not much difference between them, except that there are some red bars to the right of the blue bars. And the red bars represent strains that have higher MICs than any other strain. They are non-wild type, they contain phenotypically detectable resistance mechanisms, etc., etc. So the creed of EUCAST is that you should not divide the wild type by a breakpoint, because it will be an artificial division which can never be reproduced in a daily clinical microbiology practice. So we will never set a breakpoint which bisects MIC distribution of important target species. We do not consider the biological variation between individuals inside the wild type big enough to be reproducible. Individuals inside the wild type lack phenotypically expressed resistance mechanisms. We know that. We can test that with genomics. We can test it with repeat phenotypics, etc. We can look for resistance mechanisms. We know they do not have resistance mechanisms. So why would they be different in their relationship to the antibiotic? They have nothing to motivate why they should have a different MIC than their friend next door in the wild type. They may grow a little faster than their friend next door. They may have other biological traits that will set them slightly apart from the neighbor next door in the wild type distribution, but they don't have resistance mechanisms. And EUCAST will refuse to artificially divide the wild type with a breakpoint. Also, reproducibility is seriously affected when breakpoints split the wild type. So we make an effort to collect strains from all over the world to make it really representative, because our reasoning stands on the acceptance of the generalization that a wild type is a wild type is a wild type. So if you look at, let's say, E. coli in the database, some of those will be from urinary tract infections from women, some will be from urinary tract infections from men, some will be from seals in the Black Sea. I know that a lot of them came one day from seagulls on the coast of Chile, etc., etc. So they are extremely representative of many, many quarters of life. And all of it is uploaded into the database and made available to you at no cost. And here you can see the distribution and the table with all the MICs for meropenem and also all the zone diameters for meropenem. These are just typical in the upstairs meropenem MIC distributions, and to the right distribution zone diameter distributions, and downstairs tetracycline and strep pneumonia. And you can see that the distribution of blue and red in the MIC graphs have counterparts in the diffusion graphs. And then we look for the correlates between the zone diameter and the MIC. And that will also tell us where there will be testing problems for laboratories out there. So this is how it works. the blue bars in this case are the wild type, and the red bars are the non-wild type. And the ECOFF is the highest value in the wild type. It does not automatically mean that all wild types are treatable and all non-wild types are not treatable. That's the second part of the breakpoint setting process. There are lots of distributions out there, and this just lists examples of where they come from. And I think the oldest ones are from the 1950s. There are many uses for ECOFFs, and I won't delve into this, but if you read one of the papers here, actually both of the papers will list the uses for ECOFFs. And they're being used by people interested in surveillance of resistance as a biological phenomenon and who is tired of clinical breakpoints making things difficult because they change over time and are different between countries and different between systems. But ECOFFs do not change. Once they have been established, they are firm. And that's why veterinarians and food safety, etc., are fond of using ECOFFs. We look for clinical outcome data and we're always disappointed. I've just brought 3 examples. This is from the SUS trial. One of the columns is for fosfomycin and the other one is for piperacillin and tazobactam. And the message here is that, yes, there is good clinical response in this area, in this area. In these areas, there are too few cases, so it's impossible to actually have an opinion about the clinical response. And then the other message is that when you get to Klebsiella pneumonia, there are too few strains to actually have an opinion or make an opinion about whether it works or not. And when you look at where does it work, the proof is with the wild type distribution, which means that we have scant evidence for non-wild type strains, we have scant evidence for rarer organisms, we have often lots of evidence that the wild type of a common organism will be treatable. This is for bedaquiline and Mycobacterium tuberculosis. Same message, and this is for delafloxacin. I just picked a few out of the hat, and they all showed the same message. So now you're going to be the breakpoint committee. Are you ready? You can choose any agent. What agent would you like to choose? Good. Well done. Ciprofloxacin it is. Target infections have varied over time. Target species have varied over time. Some of you will remember how strep pneumonia was once a popular target, but is now completely in disrepute when it comes to ciprofloxacin. Outcome data is available, it has taught us that we originally aimed too high. And that's a general message. When we set breakpoints, we always get it wrong. And we always set them too high. I know only of one breakpoint which was actually raised over all these years, and that was penicillin in strep pneumonia. So this is the distributions of ciprofloxacin. And you can see the concentrations on the left there and at the top. You can't read it, but never mind. So let's look at E. coli, and you can see the wild type in blue. You can see the non-wild type in red. We know where the ECOFF is because it's right there. And the question now is, where do you want the breakpoint? We know that E. coli is a reasonable target for ciprofloxacin. I mean, stewardship people will say we shouldn't use it. And EMA will say we should be, careful because there are toxic, blah, 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 all of that. But in essence, ciprofloxacin is a fantastic agent against E. coli, provided they are sensitive. But should it be 0.125, 0.25, 0.5, or should it be 1, or maybe higher? And quite honestly, we started out as at these levels, 2, 1, 0.5, and we went downwards. And we're now discussing whether it should be 0.25 or 0.125 for systemic infections and something higher maybe for urinary tract infections. So that's how the discussions go, and that's how it works over time. So you ended up with the ciprofloxacin enterobacterialis S breakpoint, which is more conservative than the original one, because I think you agreed that 1 is too high, and the current one is 0.5, and the discussion is should it be 0.25. Let's look at another quirk, the categories. We're used to S and I and R, and we have S, I, and R, but the meaning of I in EUCAST has changed. It's now susceptible increased exposure. So we have 2 susceptible categories and only 1 resistant. And that is maybe the take-home message that you need to go home and make sure all your clinical colleagues understand, because sometimes they will not get anything better than an I. Trimethoprim sulfur for Stenotrophomonas maltophilia, we discussed that earlier. And if they haven't understood that I is as good as an S, but with a reminder to think about dosing, then they are going to be stumped. And they are going to ask you for ceftazidime on Stenotrophomonas maltophilia, which is actually a crap combination. So it's important to understand both S and I, and that they're equally good, but that I contains that reminder to mind the dose. And that R still means R resistant, irrespective of exposure. IE means that EUCAST has looked deep into the issue and decided that there was not enough evidence to set a breakpoint, a numerical breakpoint. So this is sort of an encouragement that this will probably work, but you need to use that document when there are no breakpoints. Whereas a dash means, yes, we have looked at this, we've set a breakpoint, and the breakpoint renders every single organism of that species resistant. We could have put an R instead of the I, or instead of the dash, and that would maybe have been clearer. But for your purpose, you need to go home and make sure that when there isn't a dash, that is a valid breakpoint which says whatever you do, if you have to report, report R. So when you find an IE in the table, don't go looking for breakpoints elsewhere. We've already dealt with the breakpoint, and there is no clinical evidence that you can predict the outcome with the numerical value. A dash, same thing. Here we have decided that there is no way this is ever going to work. Arbitrary breakpoints ensures that you will never have an S. The best you will have is an I, and we don't want there to be a mistake about that. And for breakpoints in brackets, it can still be used, but you need to make sure that you add some other adjunctive measure. EUCAST will publish warnings, as I said, and for anyone who is interested in warnings, go to the warnings site. It's in the left-hand margin, and you will find all the warnings. So here we are with our quirks, and here's the list, and let's look at them one by one. So PK/PD is considered one of several useful tools for breakpoints, but we can see no evidence to suggest that there is a useful difference between individuals inside the wild type, and PK/PD breakpoints will split wild type distributions. It's just in their nature that they do not take into account the wild type distribution. Why do we insist on identifying the MIC wild type distribution? We want to be able to compare the inherent activity and differences between species. And the normal must be known for us to successfully identify the abnormal. And also to establish robust correlates between the reference and the surrogate methods. How is there a difference between ECOFFs and clinical breakpoints? A breakpoint predicts clinical outcome. An ECOFF predicts the presence or absence of a phenotypically identifiable resistance mechanism. The presence or absence of a resistance mechanism does not promise clinical good outcome or the failure. However, having said that, a lot of the clinical breakpoints will, by necessity, actually end up very close to or on the ECOFF. And that's the subject for a different talk. Here is a frequent question. Are all EUCAST clinical breakpoints based on ECOFFs? Of course not. Clinical breakpoints are based on clinical outcome. But all clinical breakpoints respect the wild type and the ECOFF. Why was there a need for new susceptibility categories and definitions? Because the meaning of I turned out to become I don't know, I don't care. I would never respond with an I. I would always transform an I to an R. And in parts of Australia, they stopped producing I's in their reports. They just changed them to R's. That means you've lost the respect of one of the categories completely, and it's been rendered useless. What we did was we reviewed all breakpoints, we reviewed all the dosing needed to treat infections, and we set up a system where S and I are both susceptible breakpoint categories, and R is the only resistant one. With arbitrary breakpoints, how will we report or ever offer an S? The whole idea behind the arbitrary breakpoint is that there will never be no S. Brackets we've discussed. Area of technical uncertainty is to warn people about technical difficulties in the testing. How to use screening breakpoints in tables. A positive screen, for example, the cefoxitin screen for MRSA. A positive screen means that you could report resistant to one or several agents. And with cefoxitin, we report all beta-lactam agents except ceftaroline and ceftobiprole resistant for an MRSA. And it's just common knowledge based on years of experience that that is the case. If we have erythromycin resistance in a strep, we will report erythromycin resistance, and we will probably also report roxithromycin, azithromycin, etc. resistant, because the macrolide resistance is universal in those cases. Some people think that the dosing tab is a recommendation from EUCAST as to what doses should be used when treating infections. That is not the case. But it tells you what dosing and exposure was considered by EUCAST when they set the breakpoints, because every breakpoint is related to an exposure. So if you in your clinical practice have a decidedly lower standard dose for treating a certain infection than what is in the breakpoint dosing tab, then you may need to consider whether you can use the breakpoints from EUCAST, because the breakpoints were set with a dose and an exposure, pharmacokinetics, etc., in mind. So it's just a piece of information to tell you that if you're in the same ballpark with your practice, then the breakpoints will be valid also in your hospital, in your lab. Work in progress. We are now, together with the European Society for Pediatric Infections, looking at how do we translate the dosing tab for adults to the pediatric situation. So, in recognition of all the hard-working colleagues in the steering committee over the years and this array of pictures will change from one year to another. Some people come and some people go. Some people are difficult to get rid of, but in the old days, we would always travel to meet. Nowadays, we save money and flight hours and emissions and what have you not by meeting every second time, at least over Zoom or Teams. Thank you very much, and thank you for the award.